Good morning everyone. My name's Cheryl. I'm a PhD student within the EML department studying early modern literature, and of course I'm an FSLT participant. As you'll have probably already noticed, I'm not live this morning. I've had a few, I suppose you'd say, tech issues. Unfortunately I wasn't able to connect my microphone to Adobe Connect, so I'm using my pre-recorded presentation sort of backup file. Apologies for that. I'm hoping to get my microphone hooked up whilst this presentation is going on so that I can be a bit more personal in my interactions during the question and answer sessions. If not though, please bear with me and I'll be typing away in the chat box to the left if not. I suppose this in itself is kind of an indication of an area I need to work on before moving forward with teaching, or as I move forward with teaching, really making technology work for me rather than, I guess, the other way round. So what I thought I would do this morning is give an overview of a micro-teaching session that I gave last semester as part of another teaching course. Like some of the other participants doing the FSLT, I have very limited experience in teaching within higher education. I have worked in other educational formats. I currently work in a school, not as a teacher, but in education support. And I've had various other roles that have required teaching, whether within the school environment or in sort of other leadership formats, training and so forth. So I have a fair bit of teaching experience, I suppose, but not specifically within higher education itself. So I guess what I'm looking to do is see how I can transfer the skills that I do have into a higher education format, so that I can hopefully pursue an academic teaching career. So the micro-teaching session, similar to the format we're using on these presentations, were 10 minutes of presenting, plus 10 minutes of feedback, questions and answers, and so on. It was on our own subject areas. Everyone in the room was a student on that teaching course, and so we all spoke about our particular areas. For me, I talked about early modern witchcraft trials, and a fundamental part of the presentation, of the task, was that we had to include some group engagement. That might be through setting a task or a project for small groups. It might be through involvement by asking direct questions to members of the group and asking them to personally respond, or anything else that we could come up with. At the end, we were provided with feedback from our peers and the course tutors. And so in this presentation, I'm hoping to reflect on the session using that feedback, and also to implement Brookfield's 4 lenses and the learning cycles produced by Gibbs and Kolb as critical frameworks in which to use that feedback and that reflection to create, I suppose, an action plan for going forward in teaching within higher education. So I'm not going to spend too long going over Gibbs and Kolb's learning cycles. I imagine we're all fairly familiar with them. Now, whilst I wouldn't be as blasé as to say that they're saying exactly the same thing, I'd suggest that they do argue fairly similar points, and as a result they kind of merge together quite well. So I suppose what I'm aiming to do is to use the learning cycles together and factor in Brookfield's lenses into certain areas, such as describing how I was feeling in Gibbs' circle, conceptualising according to Kolb, so concluding from the experience, and sort of using all of the feedback to implement an action plan or active experimentation going forward. I hope that kind of makes sense. Hopefully, if not, it will become clear as I go through. I'm happy obviously to answer any further questions at the end. So I started off the presentation with the group engagement task. I split them into small groups. There were about 3 to a group, and asked them, with no further guidelines, simply to either draw or describe their impression of an early modern witch. So we got some different responses. The first group gave me a list of attributes. The second group were a bit more pictorial, so they gave me, I guess, more symbolic ideas of what constituted a witch. And the third group, I confess, gave me my favourite response, and they did win a chocolate gift because I am not above using edible incentives when I'm teaching. They presented me with a drawing of a witch with a big wart on her nose, riding on a broomstick, with the caption, "Power, she can fly," which I thought was quite funny. Following on from that, we put all of the papers up on the wall so everyone could see what the other groups had done. And we then, as a group, shared ideas. So everyone was encouraged just to shout out an idea of what they thought an early modern witch might be. So different names for them perhaps, or things that they would have to do, perhaps a satanic pact, in order to get the powers that were associated with witches at the time. Had some pop culture figures turn up as well, the Wicked Witch of the West and Hermione Granger, #BossWitch. And this was a really, really useful exercise, hopefully for the entire group. Certainly for me, it ensured that I could, I suppose, informally and hopefully in quite a fun way, test their existing knowledge. I suppose it may depend on the groups that you usually teach, how relevant this is for you, but certainly in my experience of teaching so far, I've always been sort of walking into unknown scenarios. I haven't known the learners before the session begins, and so it's quite important for me at the start to understand whether I'm talking to a group with no experience of the subject I'm discussing, or whether in fact they come from a fairly informed background. Obviously there's nothing worse than pitching a talk either at a level that's far too complicated for your learners, or indeed at a level that's just too slow, that causes them to lose interest. So from my perspective, the activity was very important for that. For the group though, I hope it encouraged participation from all of the participants. I hope it gave them the feeling that they could all contribute to the task. For those less confident, it meant they could talk in small groups, explain their ideas, it could be put down on paper. For those who were more confident, they had the opportunity then to feedback perhaps as the spokesperson of their group, and they could feedback to the whole class and take on more of a leadership role. Importantly as well, the activity, I really wanted it to be fun. I wanted there to be humour involved and for it to be light-hearted. Humour for me is really, really important in teaching. Largely, I suppose, because my experience as a learner has been that I've always responded better to teachers who have been able to find humour within their subject, who have been able to make their subject approachable. I find that from my personal experience, teachers who present their subject as this really, really serious and non-negotiable discipline kind of almost block me out from it. It seems impenetrable from the outset. So I kind of like to make people feel comfortable when I'm teaching, so that they feel like they can ask questions, that they can question things, and that it's a much more collaborative learning experience. So at the after this activity, I provided, I suppose, a lecture style section for the presentation, about 5 minutes, just discussing the witchcraft trials in England, providing some comparisons to Europe at the time. And then we concluded the session by coming back together and suggesting some new ideas about the types of people actually likely to be convicted of witchcraft in the early modern period. As you can see, despite it being quite a simplistic session, we got some very different ideas the second time round of what a witch might look like than we did the first time round. So following the session, everyone in the group provided feedback. So this was done verbally, but also through written feedback. And I thought this was actually really, really helpful. It meant I could take these sheets of paper home with me, I could reflect on them, evaluate what they'd said, and implement an action plan going forward. Importantly for me as well, and I suppose why I've somewhat counterintuitively put it at the top of the list, despite speaking about it last, is that I look for visual cues a lot, and that's something that I'm really finding, I suppose, challenging about this course. For me, online learning is very new, and certainly online teaching. I really rely on visual cues from learners. Eye contact is something I think is invaluable really in teaching, and I look for whether people seem confused, whether they seem uncomfortable, or whether they're sort of engaged and enjoying what I'm saying. So I suppose I'm enjoying the experience of teaching online, but I am finding it difficult because I kind of hate the fact that I'm delivering this presentation and have no idea what all your responses are as I do so. But I know it's something that I need to be more comfortable with going forward as online teaching, of course, becomes more and more popular, and certainly has a great value in terms of long distance teaching and indeed making teaching available to a wider range of people. So along with the students providing feedback, our course tutors also gave feedback at the same time. Since then, I've done similar presentations to non-higher education students and I've received similar feedback. So this has kind of confirmed for me that the feedback is reliable, it's accurate, and it's definitely established where my comfort zones are, where my strengths are perhaps, and also the areas that I need to work on, such as perhaps not relying on visual cues from the group so much. So just to finish off, I realise we've gone slightly over the 10 minutes, so apologies for that. But acting on the feedback that I received and using the learner cycles of Kolb and Gibbs, in talks that I've given since this micro-teaching session, I've continued to utilise the strengths that were highlighted. So audience engagement, for instance, these have all been in person, so I've been able to use eye contact and so on. But importantly, I've picked up on areas that were suggested, such as providing more opportunities for participation. I do value lecturing. I do think there's a place for lecturing. As a learner, I actually quite like lectures, but I appreciate that they're not the best learning environment for every student. So I'm really trying to be more creative in how I deliver sessions, so that it's more accessible to a wider range of students, and so that I can get them more and more engaged in what they're learning. I've also started to implement learning outcomes. So at the start of a session now, I will provide the take-home message, as it were, the key thing that I want the group to take home with them to leave with. So even if they forget 80% of what I've told them that day, which hopefully won't be the case, but should it happen, hopefully they will still take away the key points which I'd intended to get across to them at the start. So that brings me to an end really. Thank you for listening. Sorry again for the pre-recording, I hope it wasn't too weird. As I say, I'm here now for any questions and comments. I'd really appreciate them, and thank you again for listening. I will hand back over to George, or whoever is hosting this morning. Thank you.